And Frederica, I'm going to mute you because it looks like there's a little bit of sound coming from
Oh, sure.
your Zoom screen. So if you would like to speak in the future, make sure you unmute yourself.
Okay.
All right. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the third and hopefully final meeting of the Goal9 Target Industries Approach Rulemaking. Again, my name is Lee McIlvaine. I'm Economic Development Specialist with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. I'm joined by colleagues here. Gordon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Gordon Howard. I'm the Community Services Division Manager for the Department of Land Conservation and Development.
And I saw Aurora sign on.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aurora Jettle, she, her pronouns, and I'm a legislative and policy analyst with the department. Thanks.
Thanks, Aurora. Is Alexis here today? I can't see everybody.
He's going to hop on in an hour after LCDC prep.
Okay, perfect. I think we might also have a late sign in from our commission liaison, Ellen Porter, who is serving as liaison to this rulemaking advisory committee. She's traveling right now, so may be joining for just part of the meeting today. And of course, we're also joined by Casaria. You want to say hello?
Good morning. Hello, everybody. Casaria Taylor, Rules Coordinator for the agency.
Thanks. Did I miss anyone from DLCD? All right. Hearing no objections. Before we do another quick round of introductions of RAC members today, I'll be resharing information about meeting accommodations. So to make this meeting more accessible for all participants, I'll be reading and describing each slide in its entirety so that the content is clear for everyone. This slide is titled Welcome Back, Accessibility Accommodations for RAC members who are blind or visually impaired. It contains 6 bullet points describing strategies, participant etiquette, and techniques we'll be using during our meeting. So I'll now read those bullet points. So we ask that all participants state your name every time before you make a comment, even if it's mid-discussion. Slides will be read or described completely before any additional context or discussion is provided by presenters. Meeting participants are requested to remain on mute unless they're speaking. Clear audio is especially important for members of this committee. Chat will not be enabled during the meeting, so participants may send a direct message to DLCD staff. Please do not use Zoom reactions in response to polling types of inquiries from staff. We'll request a verbal response. And please raise your hand to participate in the discussion. Myself or Casaria can recognize people to speak. And if you can't locate your raise hand button, you may raise your actual real life hand and Casaria can help us take note of that. Are there any questions about meeting accommodations? All right, this slide is titled Introductions, and we're asking people to share your name, the organization that you are affiliated with or interest that you represent to this rulemaking. And our icebreaker question this time around is, what is your favorite place in Oregon? I already introduced myself, but I'll go again. Lee McIlvaine, Economic Development Specialist with DLCD, leading this rulemaking. And I have a lot of favorite places in Oregon, but if I have to pick only one, it's a small campground on the South Fork of the Santiam River where I go camping with my family every year. And I'll just kind of call on everyone so that we don't have to popcorn around because I really don't like that. It gets confusing. So I'll go to Casaria.
Good morning, Casaria Taylor, Rules Coordinator for the agency. And my favorite place would probably be Tumalo. It's a great place to get water access and go camping.
Thanks. Gordon?
Gordon Howard, Community Services Division Manager, and my favorite place is looking out my deck into my backyard in the forest.
That's really nice. Heather King.
Hi, everybody. My name is Heather King. I'm the Executive Director of the Columbia Slough Watershed Council up in North Portland. And I don't know if I can name one place, but my friends have a place out near Pendleton. It's on 5 acres, and I can go out there and hang out with camp anytime I want. So that's one of my favorite places.
How about Anthony Reeder?
Hey there, everyone. Good morning. Anthony Reeder here. I use he, him pronouns. I'm here representing the city of Hillsborough and by proxy other kind of larger and mid-sized cities. Favorite place in Oregon, I would say the Columbia River Gorge, specifically La Tourelle Falls and Rooster Rock State Park.
Aurora?
Hi, Aurora Jettle, legislator and policy analyst with the department. I would say my favorite place in Oregon, probably on the coast, like in Florence. I would go out there a lot when I was in school, so it's very peaceful. Look out at the water.
Beth Goodman.
It's so hard to name. But my favorite place, if I have to choose one, is Lake Waldo. But I love the mid coast also.
Thanks. How about Brian Pohl?
Good morning, everybody. Brian Pohl, Community Development Director for the City of Forest Grove. And my favorite place in Oregon is Freem Brewing in Hood River.
I also love Frim Brewing. Dave Honeycutt, you're next.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Dave Honeycutt, Oregon Property Owners Association. My favorite place, which is great because I spend the most time there, is my house.
I think a lot of people probably feel that way. Frederica?
My name is Frederica Banks. I am representing people with disabilities and other interested parties. My favorite place in Oregon, which it's kind of hard because I haven't seen the whole state, but I love Crystal Brook Rhododendron Garden and the corridor going west on I-26, where it's like trees just on both sides and it provides dappled light. It's like totally cool.
Thanks. How about Larry?
Larry Hulsgang. I'm a regional development officer for Business Oregon, and too many places in Oregon I really like, but I will go with Crater Lake because I love to go up and ride my bike around the rim in the summertime, and I like to go up and cross-country ski in the wintertime. So I spend a lot of time with my annual pass up at Crater Lake.
Nellie?
Nellie McAdams, she, her pronouns, with Farmland First. And my favorite place is my farm in Gaston. We have about 400 acres of hazelnuts, timber, and winter wheat.
Thanks, Nellie. Ted?
Good morning, Ted Reed, Metro Regional Planning. My favorite place, and I think a lot of other people feel this way, is Mount Hood.
And I have Todd Borkowitz here, but I'm wondering if we can clarify, Todd, if you are serving on the RAC or stepping in for someone today?
Yeah, I am stepping in for Matt Craigie with Washington County.
Thank you.
But my name is Todd Borkowitz. My favorite place in Oregon, or actually I'm a senior planner with Washington County in LUT. Favorite place in Oregon is a tie between downtown Portland and the Oregon High Desert.
Wonderful. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for sharing. I think we can all agree that Oregon has many wonderful places. So today we are first going to go over the agenda. So this slide shows the timeline for our meeting this morning. From 9 o'clock to 9:15, we're in the process of going over introductions and our packet overview. We will spend the first part of the meeting this morning reviewing the fiscal impact statement until 10:15. From 10:15 to 10:25, if we're on schedule, we'll take a quick break so that everyone can get up and stretch a little bit. And then from 10:25 to just before noon at 11:50, we'll review the final draft rule, hopefully. And then we'll spend the last 10 minutes of our meeting from 11:50 to noon today, just reviewing our timeline for progress on developing this rule and going over next steps. So like I said, we're focusing on review of the fiscal impact statement first, and that conversation is going to conclude promptly at 10:25, if not earlier, so that we have adequate time for the final draft rule, which I think is probably the most important agenda item this morning. Okay, this slide is titled Packet Materials, and it identifies each of the attachments you received in your packet last week. So that includes the meeting minutes from the second convening of this Rulemaking Advisory Committee on May 2nd, 2024. It includes the fiscal impact statement, the final draft rule amendment, and then comments from members of the Rules Advisory Committee from Frederica Banks, Farmland First, and 1000 Friends of Oregon that we received before the deadline and were requested to send around to fellow members of your committee. And I just will take a moment now to note that in addition to fiscal impacts, all state agencies are required to evaluate the impact of new or amended rules on racial equity and housing costs as well. Rules Advisory Committee members are only required to review the fiscal impact statements, though. So if you would like to review or comment on the racial equity or housing cost impact statements, we can distribute those to you after the meeting today. So just let me or Casaria know if you would like to see them. This slide is titled Fiscal Impact Statement, and it says Oregon Revised Statute, some large number I'm not going to read, requires state agencies to identify any persons this proposed rule could affect economically, including small businesses as identified in ORS 183.310, Section 10, large businesses, state agencies, including DLCD and any other state agency, local governments, and the public. So the purpose of the fiscal impact statement is to evaluate whether there's going to be an economic impact from the new rule, primarily looking for an increase in cost to particular groups and organizations. And we need to take that into consideration as we evaluate whether these rules should be recommended for adoption by our commission. And then statute just directs us to evaluate impacts on these groups specifically. This slide is also titled Fiscal Impact Statement, and it summarizes the expected impacts on each group. So I'll read those now. The general fiscal impacts, as described in the fiscal impact statement, are negligible to a positive fiscal impact. For small businesses, we anticipate no additional compliance costs. For local governments, I'll go over this more in detail, but our subnotes here are that this is an optional approach. There's a possible economic opportunities analysis cost increase, but not substantive. And then potential positive fiscal impacts for local governments. For state agencies, we anticipate that the fiscal impact will be marginal, and for the public, we anticipate that the fiscal impact will be negligible. So we can probably talk about each of these as we consider the impact of the rule. I should probably note that DLCD contracted with Johnson Economics to develop all three impact statements, including the fiscal, racial, and housing cost impact statements. So Jerry Johnson, who was a member of this Rules Advisory Committee, was advised by the Department of Justice to recuse himself from further participation on the committee just out of an abundance of caution. So you'll see that all of these were produced by Johnson Economics in your packet. Getting back into the local government fiscal impact piece, I think this is probably the most important for our discussion this morning. So I did want to just start us off by addressing this section. As I mentioned while I was reading the slide, the target industries approach is not a required approach that local governments must take in an economic opportunities analysis. So there is no cost overall that would be sort of levied across all governments that are looking to comply with Goal 9 through a normal economic opportunities analysis. If they choose to use a target industries approach in their economic opportunities analysis, there might be a possible small cost increase, but probably nothing substantial. And then we also noted in the fiscal impact statement that the intention of this rulemaking is really to provide more clarity around use of the target industries approach by cities. And so there is the potential for a positive fiscal impact to cities that might otherwise be subject to some sort of litigation or legal challenge in areas where the rule was more ambiguous before. But that's the department and our consultants' take on fiscal impacts, but we would certainly like to hear from everyone here about how you feel this change in rules might impact your organization or agency that you work for. Go ahead, Larry.
I'll go ahead and start with Business Oregon. Our targeted industry assessments of what land is needed for a particular type of industry is quite old. So we have already started our process to update that and go out with a RFP in order to get more current on our matrix. Well, I don't really know the cost that's going to be at this moment, but I do think in the grand scheme of things, it still probably falls in the marginal category, like you have noted on the slide. But we do anticipate trying to participate by updating our information and making staff available as necessary in order to work with communities.
That's a great update. Thank you very much, Larry. I'm happy to hear that. I'm sure there's lots of other participants on this committee who are excited about that as well. Beth, please go ahead.
I did not read over the entire analysis very thoroughly, but I read over the first part of the fiscal analysis, and based on your summary here, which fit with my understanding, it sounds to me about what I would expect. So I'm not surprised by the analysis.
So we have some concurrence with the fiscal impact statement as distributed. Are there any local governments who are having a reaction to this update to the rules and thoughts about how it is that they would comply with it? Yeah, please jump in, Anthony.
Just one thing that I don't know that was fully reflected in the analysis is there may be some resource or administrative burden to local jurisdictions in terms of setting up processes and procedures to make sure that lands brought in under the targeted industries approach stay locked and assigned to those targeted industries into the future. And it might be in terms of either setting up an overlay zone or some additional administrative kind of processes to make sure that they're being true to the rule.
Thanks, that's a very good observation. And that was Anthony Reeder with the City of Hillsborough. Others? Sure, please go ahead, Frederica.
So as I understand it, as you were reading it, and do forgive my ignorance on some of this, but what does that, I have more of a question than any kind of statement. What does that mean for, people, having housing and, those different things, just prices of rent, or will there be more, businesses in these areas?
Yeah, that's a really astute question. So the fiscal impact statement notes that there is the potential for additional local economic growth as a result of this rule, which could have an impact on small and large businesses, and was generally assumed to be positive in terms of increased supply chain connections, more opportunities for growth, that sort of thing. I think that sometimes the fiscal impact rule is interpreted to mean that we should be looking at any changes that are proposed here as having the potential to increase compliance costs for small businesses. So is there an additional regulation that a small or other business would need to comply with as a result of this change? And through that perspective, there's no additional compliance costs for small businesses, but there might be additional economic opportunities. In terms of housing and rent costs, it's great that you asked that because the state has a rule that we do need to evaluate any changes to administrative rules from the perspective of whether this will increase housing costs. And since we are not looking at housing in particular with
Right.
this rule amendment, our housing cost impact analysis is somewhat short, and I'm happy to send it to you after this meeting.
I would appreciate that.
Yeah, but it found that, or at least is making the assumption that this will not increase the cost of housing, but might increase local populations if we do see successful implementation of target industries approach by some communities. And so, there are, I suppose, spin-off effects from this sort of rule.
Okay.
Do you have any other questions?
I do. With this fiscal, okay, with that, and other things coming in, will that open the market for new jobs and things like that?
Yes,
So
I
that,
think we'll pause for just a moment. Kasaria, are we good with our Zoom live stream?
Live stream has been great. Yeah, it was just the local recording. We're good.
Understood. Okay, thank you. So Frederica, you were asking if there might be more jobs as a result of this rule. And yes, I do think that is possible.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your questions. If there's other questions generally about the purpose of the fiscal impact statement or what's required here of the department or just sort of what it covers, please feel free to voice them. This is a, pretty arcane section of rulemaking. Okay, Well, hearing none, we're well ahead of schedule on our agenda this morning, which is great. If you would like to see the racial equity impact statement or the housing cost impact statement, please just send a chat right now to Casaria and we can make sure that those get distributed to you. And I think probably since we're early in the meeting, we'll just jump right into our next agenda item. So what we'll do now is go into a walkthrough of the revised rule draft for your consideration. So I'm going to switch my screen share to the draft rule itself. And we'll begin by covering the most recent amendments introduced to this draft by the department since our second meeting in May. Give me just one moment. Looks like I have a couple versions of this open. I apologize for the delay. All right, can I get confirmation from someone that the Word document is visible on the screen? Okay, I see thumbs up. Thank you very much. All right, so we have a little bit of extra time this morning, so I think I'm going to go ahead and just revisit all of the sections of the rule that we are going to be amending. But I will provide some special focus on changes that have been introduced to this draft between May and now. So apologies for making everyone scroll sick here. Okay, so our first change to this rule introduces a definition of target industry. This means an economic subsector defined by the 2022 U.S. Census Bureau Economic Census through the North American Industry Classification System, or NAICS, using a 3-digit code or more specific industry classification. Local governments may rely on former or current industry classifications if the NAICS is updated after submittal of a notice of proposed change to a comprehensive plan or land use regulation pursuant to Oregon Revised Statute 197.610 and Oregon Administrative Rules, Chapter 660, Division 18, Section 20. So, the change that we have introduced to this definition between May and today's meeting is in response to feedback that we received from Beth during our last discussion, which is that an economic opportunities analysis takes time, certainly, to produce. And if we are in the midst of an update to the North American Industry Classification System and a community has already selected certain target industries based on the 2022 NAICS, that we would need some clarity on how it is that they should interpret their NAICS classification going forward. So our response here was to allow that community to select whether it would like to rely on the former NAICS or the current NAICS at the time of its adoption. We did receive some comments about whether a 3-digit code is appropriate or not, and we can talk a little bit more about industry clustering in a future section here. But I'm wondering if any members of the committee who had thoughts on the level of specificity for the definition of target industries would like to make any comments now.
Lee, this is Nellie. I'm trying to find the raise hand function. I'm unable to find it, so I'm raising my hand verbally.
Okay, we see you.
This is Nellie McAdams. I'll try and fix that. My apologies. This is Nellie McAdams with Farmland First. I do think that at least a 3-digit next subsect makes sense because there are only 96 three-digit subsectors, and about a third of those at least are not going to be subject to an EOA, so they're non-urban or public facilities or other things. And so, that doesn't really leave a whole ton. And if we were going to go more general to two digits, I think that was only 20 subsectors, and 7 of those were irrelevant. And so that only left 13. So, for me, it doesn't really make sense to just have specificity at 13 different sectors. That doesn't really, in my imagination, give a municipality enough information to make sound planning choices around. I guess one of my questions is this the only criteria by which industries are designated? Some other criteria like connecting it to employment projections, ensuring that there's sufficient capacity for infrastructure and services, and ensuring that that the city is uniquely positioned to attract that kind of business. I mean, those might not be fit for a definition. They might be more criteria, but I just wanted to open the conversation on whether the next digits are the only way in which a target industry is identified.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. Nellie, I think that in regards to suitability for a particular community, some of that information is addressed through the section of this rule that discusses community development potential and whether an industry might be appropriate or inappropriate for a city to be thinking about growth opportunities in. And so I think that there is an existing section of this rule that speaks to that somewhat, but I definitely appreciate the comment there. And then I'm trying, oh, your other comment was related to whether NAICS is the only methodology through which we would define a target industry. And I think that it's important that we have a clear system of definitions in place that we can rely on. And it is convenient for the state to rely on federal categories and definitions. Otherwise, we open ourselves up to quite a bit more, I think, opacity or lack of transparency or clarity around how it is that a target industry could be identified. The department's perspective on this is that the NAICS system is the most straightforward. It's also the most relied upon by other state agencies that are responsible for putting together economic data that are used by cities and consultants who put together economic opportunities analyses. But I appreciate that it is not the only way that a business could be defined, but for the purposes of this rule, it seems to be the most straightforward. I would ask if others have thoughts on that, though. And in the meantime, Anthony, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi there, Anthony Reeder with the City of Hillsborough. I just wanted to make a comment that one thing I appreciated about the original, the yellow highlighted portion of this section, and just to reiterate that I appreciate that it's set at that 3-digit code, but leaves room for a more specific industry classification. So if there is something at the 4 or 5-digit level, a jurisdiction can really be explicit about what they're trying to seek, while still giving some kind of flexibility within that general industry at the 3-digit level. So I appreciated both the opportunity for specificity, but without getting too constrained.
Thanks for the comment. Larry?
I just thought I'd go on record to say that I think the 3-digit code level is an appropriate level. There may be, as Anthony was mentioning, reasons to go more specific on occasion, but I wouldn't want to force that. So it's great to have it as an option if it serves a purpose. But I'm supportive of the 3-digit code level.
Thank you.
In
And
terms
Anthony, is
of
that
the
in?
previous discussion on NAICS codes, I just don't. Yeah, I think we need to be able to, easily, define, what a company industry is, and the NAICS code is nationally recognized, and so I think it's the best system that I can think of.
Thanks. Anthony, please go ahead.
Yeah, just a clarifying question. Anthony Reeder here, City of Hillsborough. Just want to make sure that my recollection is correct, that it's later in the rule where we get kind of some more discussion of clustering and how different NAICS codes might reasonably relate to one another and be bundled or kind of combined. Is that correct?
Yes, that is
Okay,
correct.
perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for asking. Okay, I'm going to scroll onward here. All right, so Division 9, Section 15 is the portion of this rule that provides a process for an economic opportunities analysis. And the changes that we have proposed here have not undergone any evolution, I think, since our first meeting of this Rules Advisory Committee. But basically what we have done here is introduce target industries as a potential reason that a potential area that a community might want to look further into in their review of national, state, regional, county, and local trends. So we're identifying employment growth forecast and target industries potentially as separate approaches that a community might take to thinking about their economic development potential. And then the second change in this section of the economic opportunities analysis notes that the EOA needs to demonstrate how expected employment growth is expected to be accommodated on the identified sites. So that means that a city can continue to use a regular employment forecast, and they may also introduce target industries, but it's the expectation of the department that the economic opportunities analysis should demonstrate in some way what the total amount of expected job growth is going to be, even in those target industries, and how those jobs are going to be accommodated on target industry sites. Nellie, please go ahead.
Thank you, Lee. Nellie McAdams with Farmland First. So I understand, I guess, two things. First, I understand that a city would need to demonstrate how many jobs or how the land is connected to that job growth. But is there a certain threshold or expectation? Or I'm just trying to think, like, what would an enforcement action look like on that? If how would a city demonstrate that it has met the burden under that test? And then second, we moved on from definitions, but I did want to flag that I do think that the rules would benefit from more clarity, especially on development constraints. So development constraints potentially including impacts on marginalized communities or on natural resources. And actually, I think that would benefit from calling out and having a more thorough definition of underdeveloped land, not just vacant. So land that isn't fully occupied beyond what the definition provides, or is at a lower density than would be ideal. So I just wanted to throw out that as well.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good comment. I think the department is trying to, at least in the way that this has been drafted, sort of navigate a tension between being overly prescriptive on how a community should conduct this analysis, and also allowing a wide degree of flexibility. We want to find the balance between those two things, which is why subsection 2 here, identification of required sites, leaves, I think, some space for a community to determine how it would like to demonstrate how that employment growth is going to be expected to be accommodated on identified sites. We don't want to say you must do this in this certain way, but I agree that that leaves some ambiguity in terms of how it is a city demonstrates that it is in compliance with this. Usually when we are evaluating an economic opportunities analysis or other major plan amendment that requires the department's review, we look at things through a test of reasonability, and I'm wondering if Gordon might like to expound on that.
Well, yeah, I think that most likely, it's with a lot of these things, it's substantial evidence test, if you will. The economic opportunities analysis will provide the information to justify to make this demonstration, and reviewers of that will question that, and if the local government doesn't resolve it to the viewer's satisfaction, they'll potentially these normally would be an appeal filed to the Land Use Board of Appeals, and the department would review them as well. Obviously, it is fairly subjective. The problem with being, as Lee said, with being a lot more prescriptive on this and objective is that there are a number of ways a city could make that determination, that demonstration that's required by this sentence, and we don't want to preclude a city from doing that. If the city you were to misuse or abuse this section, I think it would be up to the department and others to get a judicial determination at that point whether the city had done that. And you'd essentially make some case law around this statement that would help other jurisdictions. But the problem with case law is it tends to, as we've seen in some other circumstances, the case law from Luba and others sometimes tends to add additional subjective statements upon a subjective statement, and it isn't very helpful in the long run. So anyway, that's kind of the conundrum we have here. But I think that introducing this statement makes it clear that local governments are required to do this. It's not clear currently. That's why we're proposing to add this statement. And then beyond that, it will be a kind of a give and take, and with situations that are probably unique to different cities.
Thanks, Gordon. That was helpful. Anthony?
Hey there, Anthony Reeder with the City of Hillsborough. I guess I'm wondering if there is understanding that the rule needs to have some pretty significant clarity to it. If it's reasonable to look to give maybe some examples of not wouldn't want to call it a safe harbor by any means, but some examples of resources that jurisdictions could use to demonstrate that. So whether it's a document from Business Oregon or a survey of similarly cited industries in other Oregon communities, just to kind of make sure that people have a point in the right direction, and that way that we're not consistently trying to create something from whole cloth or copy something that somebody else has done before. I just don't know if that would be helpful or if this is the place for it or not.
I think what you're proposing, Anthony, is maybe an including but not limited to type of list. We can certainly look at that, Lee and I, and see if that would be helpful in the context of this particular rule. Yeah.
I'm realizing that we did not respond to Nellie's secondary question, which is about providing more clarity around development constraints, impact on resources, or underserved communities. And I wanted to thank you for that comment, Nellie, and also note that the commission did not include addressing that in its rulemaking charge for this effort. But I think that it is a comment that would be probably well received by the commission when we hold the first public hearing on this proposed change in September. So please don't let it slip. We appreciate it. Are there other questions on this section? Okay. Is it just very hot where everyone is this morning? I'm going to continue scrolling. All right, we are in section 20 of this rule. Oh, Gil, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Lee, I apologize. I didn't get the invitation for this meeting or if there were any materials sent out. So I'll just listen, try to catch up as best I can today, and then I may send you some comments or questions in the next day or two, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that, Gil, and apologies for not including you.
Okay.
Kazari, can you please send Gil the packet materials so that he has them in hand?
Will do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, so we are on section 20 of this rule, industrial and other employment development policies. Moving through section 25, designation of lands for industrial and other employment uses. Okay, so we have made a substantial change to this section of the rule overall, and then a smaller change between our May meeting and today's convening of the committee. The small change here is in blue. So what we have proposed is to remove some language from section 1 of this rule and divide it into 2 sections so that we can get a little bit more specific about number 1, plans that are relying on safe harbor employment growth forecasts, and secondly, plans that are including sites for target industries. So those target industries approach EOAs. So our language change here in section A is not especially different from what we removed from subsection 1 of this rule. It says that plans relying on safe harbor employment growth forecasts do not need to provide a different type of site for each industrial or other employment use. Compatible uses with similar site characteristics may be combined into broad site categories. Several broad site categories will provide for industrial and other employment uses likely to occur in most planning areas. And so that's been the traditional approach to assigning a jobs forecast to different types of employment land. Subsection B here is where we're seeing the most significant changes. So this is where we're addressing the ability of a city to include target industries in its economic opportunities analysis. So this reads, plans may include sites for one or more target industries. Associated target industries with similar site needs may be combined for site identification. Target industry site needs must be typical of industry site characteristics. Plans including target industry site needs should demonstrate consistency with Oregon Business Development Department or OBDD guidance or other industry standards regarding typical site characteristics. Examples of sources include, but are not limited to, industry reports, citation of existing developments, or OBDD publications. Sites identified through the target industries approach may not be planned for retail development. So I think everyone here has heard and communicated back to us that although the Business Oregon Site Requirements Matrix is sort of the gold standard that we tend to rely on when conducting an economic opportunities analysis, it's appropriate to allow cities to rely on other publications, other sources, because industry and economic development move quickly and perhaps more quickly than business organ is able to produce a publication or even be able to respond quickly to an inquiry. And so we opened this up a little bit in terms of the type of justification or rationale that a city might be able to include in its EOA beyond the originally proposed business organ site requirements matrix. And Beth, I see that your hand is up.
My hand is up. I've got one question first, I think, for Larry, because Larry, I confess I wasn't listening well enough when you were talking earlier about what Business Oregon is doing. Are you guys looking at updating that matrix that Lee was just referring to?
Yes, it is quite dated and needs to be brought current. So we are putting our budget together to be able to go out and get a consultant on board to do that.
Great, thank you. I think that matrix, in my opinion, does a great job with things like topography, certainly access to water, wastewater, ports, lots of other things it does a great job of. I've got a few opinions about things that it might look at differently, but I'll hold that off if you're accepting comments when it's updated. And then
I would love to have that coordination with you when offline from here. Yeah.
I'm happy to talk to you just about any time, Larry. I'm working on a few things using that matrix right now, and there's a few ways in which, it'd be nice to have more clarity. So,
okay.
And then Lee, I'm going to hammer on one word here. It's typical. I know how hard that word is to prove in a legal sense because of the Newberg decision some years ago about the way Newberg did site characteristics. And the problem is that there are things that quote everybody knows and that you can't find anywhere in the academic literature or in industry reports that I've seen. Sometimes I guess I haven't tried looking at existing developments as well, but existing developments have some issues with regards to forecasting need for a big site because the existing developments, they've already developed a portion of that big site and maybe another portion is was then let go for the associated smaller industries clustered around it. So the ones that are a little hard are things like ownership. Everybody knows that it's hard to assemble, say, 100-acre site. I'll be silly, but out of 25-acre sites, everybody knows that that's hard. And I think the people I've talked to in with Business Oregon and site the site selectors suggest that one owner is really preferable. Sometimes 2 or 3 owners, if they are willing to work together, can be preferable. That in other words, that can be made to work. But once you get too much above that, you start to have problems with people raising their land prices and holdouts and people who aren't willing to sell. So ownership of adjacent parcels, even if you can assemble a 100-acre parcel out of those, say, 100-acre site out of those 5 different parcels, with 5 different owners, that can be problematical. And there's oftentimes not good proof of that. And it's hard to go and look at, existing developments and say, oh, 20 years ago, that was a symbol out of, this many ownerships. I don't have a great solution for that, which is not usually my usual comment. But that's going to continue to be a problem. I don't know if there's any possibility of mentioning something like ownership in this, is like, a sub, an lowercase I, that kind of thing. Availability is another one that's a different version of hard. If you have the owner, a site that could come into a UGB, but the owner has no, interest in developing it, you could say, well, this is a long range plan over the 20 years, the owner may, change or pass away. And those things are true. But when you're bringing land into a UGB, and you're looking at, we have to go to this area because it has the lowest quality farmland, and you end up bringing in a site that ends up having no productivity because the owner is not willing to develop it, which is not infrequent. You end up with a dud site. There's just no point of having that site. There might be a point in 30 years, but there's no point now. So those are the kind of things that I look through here and I go, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Oh, that's a little worrisome. Freight movement through neighborhoods. This is one that people don't argue with, but it's in the everybody knows category. But you don't want to put freight through, residential neighborhoods. That's just dangerous.
Thanks, Beth. So you're saying that, just to recap, there are some site characteristics that should be considered typical site characteristics. They are difficult to provide justification for, and that includes ownership, availability, freight movement. Maybe others have some thoughts on what some additional site characteristics might be.
Well, I mean, you've got size, you've got topography. These are things that are covered by the Business Oregon thing. You've got, distance from or access to water and wastewater. And the water and wastewater piece, those are covered well, I think, in the Goal 14 analysis. So I will mute myself now.
Okay, thanks for the comment. It's a tricky thing to get at through this rule amendment, but worth consideration. Larry?
Well, I guess I was leading to where my comment was. I think Beth's hitting on a very important point. But in terms of land ownership, it's just kind of is what it is in terms of a piece of parcel before you get into a negotiation to try to have someone buy it. I don't know how to find a solution for that in this kind of a process. What does trouble me more is in my region, do have sites that are zoned industrial where the owner is not willing to sell. And in fact, in one case, they actually bought more property adjacent to their property just to make sure people didn't encroach and develop it. So that puts it into the category of that's never going to be developed until they pass away or whatever, because they don't intend to move. And I don't know how to deal with that situation in this process, but it is a huge issue because it impacts what other land supply you can bring in.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. There is an existing section of this rule that speaks to sort of monopoly ownership of land and availability, designating something as available or unavailable based on bona fide offers. So I'm happy to go over that with anyone who has questions about it. But I do think it's something of a bigger quandary than we're able to completely solve with this particular rulemaking. And just for the record, that was Larry Holzgang with Business Oregon, and just a reminder to everyone to introduce yourself before you speak. Thank you. Other thoughts on this section? Please go ahead, Fred. You're muted, so there you go.
Okay, for Derica Banks, what I want to know is, with these different aspects of target industries, industries coming in, things like that, and the topography and, water and those developmental things to create a industry site, I will always harken back to what I always do. People, will there be infrastructure for the disabled community that may visit that industry site? You know, uh, they could be conducting business there. Will there be sidewalks? Will is accessibility a target in a particular aspect of these target things? Because it seems to me that whether you will have people with disabilities in working there or not, they will have to access that area one way or another. And so are those things being considered with these particular aspects of developing a business area?
Yeah, thank you for the comment, Frederica. Um, I wonder if we can wrap your comment and question into a discussion that we'll be having a little bit later in this meeting,
Of
because I
course.
have a feeling that Nellie is going to want to speak to infrastructure planning and that sort of thing that might be
Mhm.
required for a city to accommodate a targeted industry. And so we can
Sure.
think about this more in the context of those types of considerations
Of
and where this
course.
approach is appropriate. I
Mhm.
would appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thanks. All right, any other questions or comments on this section? All right, and I'm hoping that the changes that the department proposed here in blue, which add additional types of justifications, even if they don't answer every question, are getting us more in the right direction on the types of rationale or reasoning that cities and people who conduct economic opportunities analysis would like to see included. Scroll on. I wonder if, before we get into this large new section, we should perhaps take a quick break. Let's go ahead. It is 10:04 right now. Let's come back at 10:15, and then we can get into discussion about site designation and protections, which I think is probably where we're going to have the most comments. So everyone feel free to go off camera, stretch, get something to drink, and we'll see you at 10:15.
Lee, just so you know, you're not muted.
Oh, thanks, Alexis. Did you think I was going to say something?
Yeah, something devastating.
No. Hello?
Hi, Frederica. We're not quite back yet.
Oh,
Okay, I have 10:15, so folks could come back on camera to show me that you have returned. I'd appreciate it. And while we're waiting for everybody to appear back in their Zoom boxes, I'll reshare the document. All right, so I think we're about to get into discussion of the section of the rule that I anticipate there being perhaps the strongest feelings about from most of the interested parties who are participating on this committee and others who will be interested in this rule when it comes before commission. So I want to make sure that we're getting it as right as possible. So this is the section of the rule that DLCD has created that describes basically designation of sites and site protections for use by target industries. And this section has undergone substantial modification from how it was first drafted, and then after each successive committee meeting that we have held based on the input that we have received from this group. I'm going to go ahead and read the entire thing, and then I will go back and note the changes that we've made between the second meeting of this RAC and today's meeting. So, what we are saying in this section is that local governments that estimate land demand using site requirements of target industries in an economic opportunities analysis must adopt land use regulations that designate and preserve specific sites for use by target industries by zoning ordinance or local measure. And then included in this subsection are these two provisions. Sites designated for target industries may be developed for unanticipated employment uses based upon adopted findings in a legislative or quasi-judicial land use decision that the proposed non-target industry use offers equal or higher local economic and community benefit. We are also saying as a subsection here that unless a local government adopts a post-acknowledgement plan amendment consisting of an updated economic opportunities analysis to rezone those target industry sites, that sites designated for target industries that don't develop with the anticipated use may not be rezoned for commercial or residential use, and target industry sites zoned for other employment uses may not be rezoned for residential use. So that section essentially says that a local government needs to adopt an updated EOA in order to rezone from industrial to any other use or from another type of employment use to a residential use. All right. Thirdly, in this section, we're saying local land use regulations establishing sites for target industries may include provisions for non-industrial development that is subordinate to and supportive of the primary industrial development. This section was included in response to comments that we received from this committee during our last meeting that we would not want to be designating and developing large industrial sites that don't actually serve the workers that are going to be employed on those sites. So the intention here is that any additional included use on the site should be something that is subordinate to and supports that primary target industry. And then finally, we say in this rule that target industry sites must be protected by limiting land divisions and permissible uses and activities that interfere with the development of the site for its intended use. And where necessary, cities must protect a site for the intended use by including measures that either prevent or appropriately restrict incompatible uses on adjacent and nearby lands. So the sections of this that have been modified since we last met include more specificity in section 9, little a, big A here, where we're just including more information about the type of findings that a city would need to include to develop a site for an unintended or unanticipated use. So being more specific that this needs to be a legislative or quasi-judicial land use decision. And then we also changed this language here to not just say equal or higher economic benefit, but also to include community benefit based on what we heard from this group. There was some concern expressed during the last meeting that the phrase community benefit could potentially be interpreted to include residential uses, residential development. And so I just wanted to point out that the remainder of this section of the rule is pretty clear that it does not allow residential development without a new economic opportunities analysis demonstrating that the site is not needed any longer. Let's see, we're in 9, little a, big B here, so this fully blue section. This is just a rephrasing of the way that this this rule draft was listed, sort of in terms of like the flow of the rule from the last time around. So if you're reading this and it seems unfamiliar, it's just sort of a reordering for clarity in how it is that we're describing these provisions. And then let's see, we're in section 9, little a, big C here, and this is a completely new section that we included based on recommendations from this committee that we should allow some subordinate and supportive development on large industrial sites. So that's how this is shaped up based on the feedback that we have received, and I absolutely welcome comments. Gil, please go ahead. You're muted.
Sorry, is that now, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thanks very much, Lee. Gil Kelly, representing Thousand Friends here on this committee. I appreciate what you're trying to do here and give us a little more guidance based on our earlier discussions. I guess I'm still a little bit curious as to how the equivalent or equal or better economic value would be viewed by the department or the commission if there were a challenge. And I guess one example is, and I hope this is not the case, but it'd be interesting to see how it might be viewed by Gordon or others. If the target industries were a set of tech related, for example, nothing happened for a while, and so a site owner comes forward with a regional distribution center that doesn't have anywhere near the amount of employment or even the variety of skill levels and income levels or wage levels associated with it. Would that sort of be an automatic, this is not equal or better? In other words, I'm just wondering if we throw something around employment into these definitions to give some guidance, because for the landowner, it might be equal or equivalent value in that case I just mentioned. So hypothetical. So I'm just kind of wondering how this would be interpreted over time.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I agree that there's some ambiguity in this section. Again, this is an example of the department trying to find the correct balance between being overly prescriptive,
Right.
and also allowing some but not too much flexibility, especially when it comes to designating significant employment sites, or at least what we hope will be significant employment
Right.
sites.
Right.
And I do think it is very illustrative to go through some examples of how the department might interpret something. In your example of a tech industry with a high quantity of jobs and presumably high wages, high skilled jobs, to a distribution center, I think that the department would probably be looking for the city to include findings that there is some other community benefit for their rationale to do that. Obviously, the job creation is not equivalent. So is the city making the case that this is perhaps, additional property tax revenue? I don't think they could make that case with a distribution center, considering the value of improvements on the site versus a tech use. So, what is the rationale that they're providing? And I think that's what we would be looking at closely. I think it needs to make sense. My colleague Kevin Young would say it needs to pass the straight face test in order for us to be
I guess,
supportive.
no, that's helpful. That's what I'm looking for, is how would this really be interpreted? And I just have some, because after 5 years they go, well, oh well, we tried and couldn't find anybody, so we're going to default to this other economic use. And it's like, well, was that really an appropriate use of a targeted industry approach versus a safe harbor approach?
Yeah,
go ahead, Gordon. Sorry.
My thoughts on this is that I think that in the example you give, if clearly the tech industry would have higher local economic and community benefit. I think the issue would be if for some reason the local government asserted that the tech industry was no longer feasible or likely to happen there, or perhaps might happen, but it would be 20 years in the future, 10 to 20 years in the future, and therefore the benefit of having something now is greater than something in 10 or 20 years. I think that would be an interesting situation. I think our response in that situation would be that instead the local government needs, instead of doing a quasi-judicial decision in this kind of thing or legislative decision, they need to do a new EOA to look at the change, if there's that kind of a fundamental change in the circumstances that makes the target industry either so remote or improbable that it's not going to happen, and therefore we want to replace it with this other thing. I think in the absence of a case that straight on that the substitute use has those greater local or economic and community benefits in the near term, that would be, I think, our department response. At least that's my initial take on it, and I see some of the members of the committee might have some alternative thoughts on that or agree or disagree with me.
I appreciate that, Gordon. I don't want to hog the airtime here, Lee, but I just, it seems to me that there are other economic uses if this is particularly lands brought inside the UGB for this purpose, they're agricultural lands outside, and those have productivity and economic use. So bringing it in and then just saying, well, we couldn't really find our target industry, so we're going to do something else, I think needs a higher standard of look and of proof than what I've been hearing or what I'm reading. Anyway, thank you. I'll hold them there.
Nellie, you're next.
Thanks. I think to that point, the economic benefit that it's being measured against, in my mind, I would sort of wonder whether that was who that economic benefit was to. Is it to the city? Is it to the public? Those might be different things. Like a data center might generate a lot of utility fees, but few jobs and the high long-term infrastructure costs might be passed on to the public. And so, for me, maybe that combination of economic and community benefits can answer that. But I have a question mark on how economic benefit is being measured and to whom it's happening. I also, just on to what Gil said as well, I do wonder whether, especially since target industries tends to take more land, and that land often has in the past been resource land, if there can be a weighing factor for goals 3, 4, and 5 for the use of target industries approach, because it is affecting those other industries and natural resources.
Just taking some notes. I agree that I think that we probably could consider adding some clarity around who the beneficiary is in 9 little a big A here, to be clear that we're not talking about local economic benefit to the landowner, for example, to make sure that we really are thinking about this through the lens of economic development. But I appreciate the comment. And as far as a weighing factor for goals 3, 4, and 5, my understanding of this is that it would be not included in the rulemaking charge provided by the commission. But Gordon, I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Which items are those again?
I think, Nellie, if I'm paraphrasing you incorrectly, please jump in, but she made a suggestion that we should perhaps be considering whether use of this approach should be considered in balance with some sort of weight factor for statewide planning goals 3, 4, and 5.
Oh, yeah. I think the point that agriculture and forestry are, in a sense, economic sectors that are impacted by, urban economic development is a legitimate item. Yeah, but it is not part of our rulemaking charge here today. But anyway, that is my thought there. But I think that the interesting item that you brought up, Nellie, was the idea of the clawback provisions, that if a site isn't ended up used for the target industry, should it be removed from the UGB? And that is an interesting idea. There's a lot of practical problems with that. We actually do have that in some other rules. The simplified urban growth boundary method has a provision that requires that, which no city has ever used. But that is the problem there is the mechanics of it and such. But anyway, yeah, that it's kind of a rambling answer. Sorry about that.
Anthony, you've been really patient. Please go ahead.
I just have, I guess, a question on 9 small a big A. the addition of equal or higher local economic and community benefit. I'm wondering about the joining and between economic and community benefit. If a community is it going to then be necessary to demonstrate explicitly both of those, or one or the other? I'm just thinking about different grounds on which a community might pursue that, and then the grounds on which they might be challenged. So
Yeah, that's a good point. Is your proposal here that and be an or?
yeah, either an or I don't want to overly overcomplicate it, but if there's, yeah, I guess the simplest would be an or, but I can certainly understand there may be other views on that. So
Thanks. I would encourage folks to, if you have some thoughts on this section for economic and community, or economic or community, please try to think of some examples of what would be a solely community benefit, perhaps other than local tax revenue, because I'm just curious how members of our committee are thinking about that. Beth, please go ahead.
So on the topic of economic benefit, I think we're going to be in the next 20 years or whatever, thinking about that a little bit differently as we get more automation, and in some cases fewer jobs, different jobs out of industrial development in a lot of cases. And so that's going to make, determining the economic benefit sometimes harder. Especially if we're looking at number of jobs expected. I think wages may well be a good measure of it. And on community benefit, I can think, data centers are definitely an example of something that has a community benefit more than an economic benefit in a lot of cases, because you don't have a lot of jobs. If you have one data center, oftentimes you'll get many data centers on a site, like you see in places like Pineville. But you don't necessarily get a lot of jobs, but you get a lot of property tax revenue out of that. So the other thing I wanted to comment on is the idea of a clawback. Remember that on some of these things, when you bring a piece of property in, it can take 7 to 10 years to get the site near to development ready, especially if you're looking at issues related, say, to availability of electricity, which isn't necessarily a local city issue, but currently we know that it's a statewide issue. That in Central Oregon, for instance, I've heard that it's not really going to be starting to be solved for 5 to 7 years. And so being careful about expectations of how fast some of these target industries can happen, it can be a really long game. In other words, it can take a really long time because of the level of services needed, and you can't plan for those services until you have land within the UGB. And sometimes there's other considerations when you're talking to private utility providers. So I will stop with that.
Good comment, thank you. I made the mistake of expanding my gallery view window so I could see everyone, and I think it rearranged the order of hands that I was seeing. I'm pretty sure that I had Nellie next. Nellie, did you want to jump in?
Thank you, Lee. Nellie with Farmland First. I agree that a clawback would be infeasible for a number of reasons. And so in a way, that's why I was recommending a goal 3, 4, and 5 consideration. And sort of looking at the header for number 9, the direction is that cities must adopt land use regulations that, my thought was that under that, in those land use regulations, they must include a goal 3, 4, and 5 wing in order to create this. So I wasn't thinking of a separate goal 3, 4, and 5 consideration. I was thinking of that being baked into the land use regulations and one of the requirements of them. And then I would say too that My preference would be to keep the and under local economic and community benefit. And one of the reasons for that is because in creating the EOA in the first instance, there are goal one requirements for involvement. But if under, I guess legislative quasi-judicial decision, there just might be less goal one public involvement in this kind of an amendment than there was in the original EOA. And so I think that there should necessarily be a consideration of how the community is impacted in order to ensure that goal one is met in some way.
Thank you, Nellie. That clarifies your comment on the goals 3, 4, and 5 piece. I appreciate that. And from this point on, I apologize if I'm going out of order, but I need to start at the top again for me. So Fred Banks, you're next, please.
Okay, so as I'm sitting here listening and you're asking, should it be an or, I'm thinking an or with the economic and community benefits. We could look at this as, say, an industry comes in, and there's community benefit. Well, they could educate the public about what they do. They can sponsor, and I'm looking at this more from an educational piece, primarily, where the industry could definitely have like learning aspects about the company and, potential internships, say if it's near a community of people with economic disadvantage, but it provides jobs, but it also provides educational growth. I'm not done talking. It could provide educational growth for the people within this community.
I think that's an excellent point. Workforce development opportunities are certainly a community benefit, and I think that's a great example.
Yeah, I because it depends on the company. Even a engineering company can have communal impact where they're teaching the young people about STEM or the aspects of, energy conservancy. Now we're looking at environmental impact and green energy. What does that look like? So there are tons of opportunities. I think it should be an or, if that would count at all.
Yeah, thanks for the suggestions. Gordon is not going to allow us to include an and or in this rule for reasons that I have heard a lot about during Community Services Division trainings.
This is Gordon Howard again. Legally, in common usage, or is used a certain way. Legally, or means one, the other, or both, and means both. And so that's really the choice legally we have in this situation. There's several judicial opinions now, long old, that call and or in terms of legal terms a grammatical monstrosity. I think that's a bit harsh. In common usage, we all use it, but legally we need to choose either and or, because or is one or the other, and is both, and so that's really the choice there.
Thank you, Gordon, and thanks for the great suggestions for types of community benefit, Fred. I think you made a very good case for or.
Okay.
Larry.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon, because I would go and advocate for or rather than and in this situation. I'm trying to think of, on the community benefit side, sometimes you might call it a community benefit if it's just job retention, but you're not necessarily getting new jobs. I'm working with 2 wood products companies, and I know of a third that are all planning on substantial capital investments into their plants. And it really is going to increase the efficiency and their ability to compete in the marketplace, but it's not going to add jobs. But it will help keep them in the community if they can accommodate that expansion. And so higher isn't necessarily always going to be the case. I also have another example where, in the case of my airport down here, we have the 173rd Air National Guard. They're changing their mission to providing training to a new aircraft. Again, it's because the old aircraft is going to be retired by the military. When they get the new mission, they aren't necessarily going to increase their employment. Could even go down just a skosh, but it will keep 1,000 employees in the community that might otherwise disappear. So community benefit can, be that too, I think.
Thanks, Larry. I agree. Gil, I believe you're next.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. I guess, first of all, I wanted to thank Anthony for raising this because it really poses some interesting questions. And I haven't quite made up my mind about and versus or, but I did want to point out that in either case, this follows the yellow text highlighted that says unanticipated employment uses. So an alternative couldn't be housing, for example, or regional retail, right, Anthony? So I'm just wanted to kind of remind. And then I also, with Larry's comment, and just remember this is the target industry approach. And so for those job retention things, I don't know if this would be even the appropriate approach to take, but it might be. I was thinking about uses that might be other anticipated employment uses. What about, because you asked for examples, Lee, what about take away the high wage tech sector and say it was expanded for a set of a kind of light industrial assembly uses, makers uses, and so forth didn't show up. And so the idea is, well, what about a sports venue there? I mean, that has employment attached to it. You could imagine a set of uses that aren't retail, strictly speaking, nor housing, but are kind of in a gray zone. And so does that go back to the original EOA and the rezoning there? How do you deal with some of these in-between uses? And some of those might be, employment development, workforce training kinds of uses and that sort of thing. So I'm just, there's some gray areas here that I think are going to be difficult to write a really prescriptive rule around. But I do think we ought to have adequate sideboard. So I'm not offering you a specific suggestion on that, except that these are employment uses we're talking about in any case.
Yeah, thank you, Gil. I would love to hear from members of the committee if you have ideas for how to provide some sideboards around those gray areas. That would be really helpful. Let's go to Allie. And a reminder, if everyone could introduce yourself before you speak.
Hey there, Allie Camp City Springfield's Economic Development Manager. I was a little bit late to the meeting, so apologize if these questions have been addressed already. What is the blue mixed with the yellow?
That makes green. I'm just joking, Allie. The blue represents changes from the last draft of the rule that you saw in May. So the blue sections represent the minor changes that we have introduced based on feedback from this committee between May and today's meeting.
Thank you. And did the group already talk about the EOA amendment versus last meeting? We started talking about maybe a time frame of allowing these sites to achieve their realities and then, being preserved for a certain amount of time, and then open to other uses in the future.
We have not really addressed that, but I
Okay.
think that there has been some comments that are sort of getting at that, what's an appropriate amount of time for a site to develop. As the rule is currently drafted, there is no time-based requirement included here. There is only local decision making around whether it's appropriate to pivot to a different but equally beneficial use, or if the city determines that the site is no longer needed for employment uses, that it would need to conduct a new EOA at that time to demonstrate it's no longer necessary.
Thank you.
Yeah, but
Um,
there have been several comments about, the time that it takes to develop a site and clawbacks and that sort of thing. So
yeah, I think I just want to echo that an amendment takes an enormous amount of time to complete, and the potential opportunities get lost in the meantime for folks to move to the area. I want to echo Beth's comments about the clawback. The time for some of these sites to be served by infrastructure to realize their development. All of that could become complicated in the future if investments are made to serve a site and then a clawback is activated. That doesn't feel beneficial or business friendly. And then I just curious the approach around economic and community benefits. I know some other programs from the state require some sort of community benefit to be demonstrated. That is always very challenging in terms of whether it's measured objectively or subjectively. So I'm curious if that's like a concern in this rule. I could see this being very squishy in the future.
I agree. It does feel squishy. The way that we have been looking at it right now, up to this point, has been a local decision and somewhat subjective, I would think, but that the department would be looking closely at the types of rationale provided. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. If at the local level and then reviewed at the state, that just puts the local level under a higher maybe like risk level for, I don't know if this gets appealed or whatever. But the clearer it can be for the local level to implement, the better, I would say.
I have some questions for you and other local governments that are represented on this committee, Ali. Do you feel that it would be preferable for this rule to define more specifically, job quantity, job quality, property tax revenue? Is that the type of clarity that you would seek to be able to feel assured in the local decisions made about use of target industry sites?
No, I see this clear and objective, or this economic and or whatever it ends up being community benefit being something that needs to be prescriptive. I don't think the way that the local government folks in this room, please correct me if I'm wrong, are approaching this is we want to be able to seize opportunities when they arise. If we are held to certain parameters, standards, performance metrics, that could eliminate folks from being able to take advantage of this land area. And we definitely don't want that. We want as much flexibility in the opportunities. I would say we want clarity in the implementation of this rule.
Yeah, Lee, if I could just jump on that really quickly. It's Anthony with the City of Hillsborough. I would echo what Ali said and further to what Beth had said about changes in the ways that work is going to happen in the coming years and decades, especially with artificial intelligence and automation. I think that tying some of these to a specific head count could be really challenging as industries evolve, and maybe the rule does or maybe does not keep up with that evolution over time. So that would be my concern there.
Excellent point. While we're on this, are there other local governments that wish to respond on this point? Okay. If you have written comments or if you have additional thoughts on this, please submit them as written comments to myself and Casaria. I'd like to read more about your thoughts on this issue. And I understand that flexibility is important, and clarity of implementation of the rule is an important piece here. And I also just want to reiterate that the use of the target industries approach is not the only way that a city can accommodate unexpected employment opportunities, right? The the purpose that is the target industries approach has in the department's thinking is that a city wishing to sort of deviate from its prior economic trajectory and really focus in on what it sees as key economic development priorities and opportunities in the future that they might not otherwise be able to make a case for, and include specific sites that can accommodate those industries. We really are hoping that this approach is used to pursue those specific opportunities, not to increase an overall urban growth boundary expansion for any purpose for an unspecified industry. And I should also mention that this is not the only way that a city can make a case for a larger urban growth boundary expansion for employment uses. There are still opportunities to increase the employment growth forecast, which our amendment to this rule is not touching at all, and think about other ways that, that cities can plan for employment land in the future. But when we think about the target industries approach and making the case for specific sites with specific site needs, we want to make sure that those sites are preserved for the uses that they were intended for in some capacity. Nellie.
Thanks. Nellie McAdams with Farmland First. I just had a couple notes about some of the exceptions around residential and commercial. I do worry that Section C, the local, that you can have provisions for non-industrial development that is subordinate to and supportive of primary industrial development, that could be a camel's nose under the tent. I don't know, if there are any limitations around that. And I also, non-residential could potentially include residential, so that's a concern of mine. And then it was interesting to me. I was looking at sort of the differences between B, I, and II, and it seemed like the difference was that in BII, it said that target industry site zoned for other employment uses may not be rezoned for residential. But then I was wondering about commercial, because that is reflected in the I above. So just a question around that.
Yeah, it's a good question. There are employment uses that are not retail that might be taking place in commercial zones. So offices, for example, healthcare facilities, services that are not necessarily developing in industrial uses or in industrial zones, but are not a retail development. And so that other employment use is intended to capture that, and then very specifically carve out retail and exclude it from this rule. Does that answer your question?
Sorry, was that about the first one or the C or the B two?
It's BII.
Yeah. I think that's fine. And that makes sense. And then I guess for C, is there any way to provide more specificity around what would be subordinate and supportive to? I don't know if that's like a percentage, that might be too prescriptive, but at least specifying that non-industrial development does not include residential unless that is covered in the other provisions.
Yeah, thanks. This is a tricky section. We included big C here in response to, I think it was Gil's comment during our last meeting that, we don't want to be developing these major industrial zones without the ability to serve the workers who are there. And I agree with you. This is one of those tricky areas where we don't want to be overly prescriptive. We want to let the market do its work and allow some flexibility. So I think we can take another look at this and see if there's an opportunity to be more clear without losing flexibility. Dave?
Thanks, Lee. Dave Honeycutt, Oregon Property Owners. I have concerns with, unsurprisingly, 9 little b and 9 little c. I appreciate the idea and the fact that it may take quite some time when a industry is targeted before the infrastructure is available to develop the site for the intended use. But in the meantime, you've got a property that's being unused, that's owned by someone that may have intended alternative uses that were compatible with the zoning prior to the time that the land was brought in and cited as a target industry that's sitting there waiting with conceivably no ability to do anything with that site. And so having some kind of inserting some type of time limitation on that would certainly be something that I would appreciate seeing. Same for C. C is actually even worse because neighboring sites may have absolutely no, they're going to be impacted by this with potentially no economic benefit to their property at all, and in some cases maybe significant diminution in value as a result of the proposal. What concerns me about that is conceivably that language in 9C could apply to properties both inside and outside the boundary, and could potentially trigger ONA violations as you have limitations on, say, residential use on adjoining parcels, which would create impacts on the city's buildable land supply and their ability to meet their housing production targets under ONA. And so I think this is potentially problematic, depending obviously on what a particular city does as it attempts to use these provisions. The last thing on C, and I know this is used in other places in the rules, but the definition of adjacent and nearby lands, I think we can all agree on what adjacent lands are, but nearby is, you're just asking for litigation. So I might limit that just to adjacent lands.
Thanks for the comments, Dave. And you're correct that this section was duplicated from elsewhere in Division 9. And I agree that nearby is not especially clear. Gil?
Yeah, well, a couple points. One is on large C. I think Nellie brought up a concern around that. I actually was supportive of this. I think suggested it, that there ought to be some level here. And I think sort of the key wording here is subordinate to and supportive of the primary industrial use. So I would include, in my mind, that includes services like childcare, for example, which I don't know falls into the retail category or not, the coffee shop, the little restaurant. I think there should be some limitations on office, unless that is a major component of the target industry itself. You want to be able to have some minor office on the thing, but office integrated into the industrial development could be legitimate if that's part of what the target industry characteristic is. But I would sort of not want to see this migrate to just kind of the standard office park over time. And maybe that office could be better accommodated in the town center, for example, rather than the expansion land. So again, I'm not offering specific suggestions on wordsmithing here, but I think we need to keep in mind the supportive piece, and that could include services like childcare and others, and minor. It's not regional retail; it's really site supportive retail for the primary uses. That doesn't mean you're limiting customers who are coming from off-site, but it means primarily it's supportive of the industrial uses on site. And I'm just kind of throwing in legislative intent here as opposed to giving extra wording, but that just something Lee and Gordon, you might consider thinking about, whether there's some sharper wording that could be accommodated in that paragraph. The other piece is, again, appreciated Anthony's talking about how one resistance to having overly prescriptive standards on what economic benefit might be for alternative employment uses. To me, the more we are in this conversation, the more this is feeling like this is becoming a very standard approach to economic land need, despite what you were saying a moment ago, Lee, about this being really around target industry. And to that degree, because you want to have some flexibility, I understand that in terms of migrating uses, and it might have slightly less or slightly different employment depending on how that industry evolves. I'm and I'm not sure it belongs in this section around the controls, but maybe more in an earlier section. I still feel strongly that there ought to be some in the economic opportunity analysis and in the legislative findings and comp plan amendments, some consideration as to within the region, however that's defined, that this is a particularly well-suited site. I wouldn't go as far as saying unique, but particularly well-suited site for the target industry. Otherwise, it becomes just sort of the more we're loose about the evolution of the industries and so forth over time and the non-prescriptive standards, which I understand the impetus for, the more it just becomes kind of, well, we're going to get some land and we'll, it will just evolve over time. Is that really a targeted industry approach? So to me, embedding some additional thought process earlier on in the findings and in the EOA that talk about why this site is particularly suited for this within its region is even more important than I raised in the last meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, Gil. Beth?
I'm going to follow up on the last two comments that were made, starting with the incompatibility issue. I don't think Dave is wrong with, I think he's right, with some of the issues on, nearby lands, certainly. A lot of the time, incompatibility is dealt with big buffers. Where that doesn't work is things like routing freight through residential neighborhoods. Obviously, that's incompatible. Smells tend to travel a long distance. Like I smell the mills from Springfield in my house in South Eugene, and that's just part of the way it is. But a lot of other things like noise and unsightliness and all of that. Those think about berms and large buffers. So being a little careful with how far you let that go. And then what Gil was just saying about supportive industries, one of my comments was that zoning and NAICS don't match up entirely. In other words, all of your industrial employment doesn't end up in industrial zones. A lot of industrial employment, most of it ends up in industrial zones. Some of it ends up in commercial zones or what you'd call employment zones. And in commercial zones, you have a bigger mixture of things like office, commercial, and retail, and certain types of industrial employment. So commercial tends to be more flexible in some of those ways. So don't necessarily equate the two entirely in your head. There's definitely a relationship, but it's not always hard and firm. And sometimes supportive businesses are like having a small retail outlet for your, selling your product. Like if you're a big bakery or I don't know, a honey maker or something like that. So having a little retail space or having your cafe in your industrial area, those are pretty important uses. What I would be careful of is a lot of retail uses that aren't connected with the businesses and the operation of the businesses in the area. Services that aren't connected with the operation of the business in the area. So like a cafe is connected, but maybe a hair salon isn't connected. Those kind of things. And I apologize, I keep forgetting to say this is Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest. So those are my comments.
Thanks, Beth. Yeah, I think there's sort of two types of supportive and subordinate uses that could be considered, and those are those, as you identified, that are directly connected to that primary industrial or other user. And then there are those that provide amenities that workers need near their places of work. And those are definitely two different things. But I do think that supportive of captures that, and subordinate to captures the connected uses. So I'm hoping that that's adequate. But if others feel that this needs to be more specific in its language, please do send us comments. Larry.
This is more of a question than a comment. I'm curious. I'm going to use an example in Allie's community. If we used the target industry approach to one day put Sony in Springfield, and it was operated there for, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years, but eventually everything changed and Sony left, and it totally evolved into an entirely different industry. If you use the targeted industry to zone that property for a company like Sony, and after 10 years they leave, and you now have an opportunity to put a different type of company in there, does this zoning still apply that far into the future?
That's a very good question. I'm feeling personally really resistant to putting any kinds of time limits on things, just because it will never be correct. We'll always have it off by at least a couple of years. I imagine that this is probably a rare case that you would have a major employer establish a industrial or other significant workplace, and then go through a process of laying off and closing that facility without the city conducting an economic opportunities analysis at some point in the meantime. Beth might have more information on this, but the amount of time it takes to plan for a specific use, actually have that use develop, get our hiring full up, and then for the economy to change significantly enough that that facility closes, that's a pretty significant span of time. And my hope is that cities in the meantime are continuing to engage in economic development planning and land use planning for employment lands. So
Haley,
yeah.
just some context around Springfield. So our EOA, sorry to jump in front of folks patiently waiting. Our EOA took years to develop. I think it started in 2008. Since then, we've had 3 large employers, Sony being one of them, do exactly that in Springfield. So I don't actually think it's like wildly unheard of that would happen within a planning time frame. We've seen it 3 times here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Larry Holzgang again. Hyundai just across the I-5 into Eugene. It was there for quite a while, and then we've been trying to fill that space. Ideally, we'll get it filled with another high-tech company, but maybe not. Who knows?
Allie, would you say that Springfield has a customary time frame around which it engages in an economic opportunities analysis?
Oh, I haven't been Camp City, Springfield. I haven't been here long enough to know. Our last one, like I said, started in 2008 or 9. Beth Goodman worked on it, and it was a part of our 2014 UGB expansion. So we are a little ways away from starting another one, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. I'm definitely hearing these comments, and I just feel compelled to respond that it really is the department's hope that a city with significant employment, especially significant transitioning employment, would conduct an economic opportunities analysis more frequently than, you know, a 15-year time frame, although I understand that there's resources that need for that to, that are required for that to occur. So just being sympathetic to what you're saying, Allie. Um, Gordon, do you have any thoughts about how we should approach sites that were initially identified through the target industries approach that may not be in use by that target industry? He went off camera, so he might have stepped away for a minute. But I'm going to make a note to think this through and welcome any comments that folks have.
Lee?
Yes, Fred?
Okay, this is Frederica Banks, and I was listening to the lady from Springfield. I was also listening to the gentleman from Eugene, and I wonder if you guys could just, I know for the gentleman in Eugene, you guys OSU or U of O is one of your biggest employers, yes?
Yes, that's correct, Fred.
Okay, so what I was wondering, is it at all possible that the Eugene City Government Council and I keep saying OHSU, but I mean U of O. Is it possible that because this is a high-tech industry, is it possible that the university, they have IT young people that are going into this? Is it possible that the university can sort of take this over in some sort of way as a learning tool, as a absolute on-the-job training teaching tool to further that? I mean, I don't know if forgive me if I'm out of line, but it seems to me that um, in this situation, for the Eugene situation, that could be taken, it's not sitting empty if the school finds a way to utilize it. Am I wrong on that?
Lee, this is Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest. Could I speak up for one moment?
Sure.
Yes.
I'm working on Eugene's economic opportunities analysis right now. The Hyundai site is almost as far from the university as you can get in town. It's across town. It's been shuttered for, Larry probably knows how long, but it's more than a decade. And it was built for something very, very specific. And the city's been working at getting an industry similar to what was there before, chip fab sort of industry or something along those lines in there, because that's what it's designed for. It's really, you don't see the University of Oregon taking that kind of role in these sorts of these sorts of industries, in part because having taught at the university in a completely different area, but having had some association, it's just not in the way of thinking of the university. You see spin-off companies come out of the university, some of which are high tech, and some of which stick around Eugene, some of which don't. But this site isn't really one that, in my guesstimation, its best use or even a good use would be something with the university, given all of those factors. I'm not speaking for the city of Eugene because I do not work for Eugene.
I understand.
Thanks, Beth. I'm going to try to get us a little bit back more on track here. And thanks for comments, both of you. And while you were speaking, I think I was doing some thinking on potential like successive uses of target industry sites. Gordon and I had considered some comments earlier in the process of this rulemaking around whether target industries approach should be used for sites that already exist within an urban growth boundary. And as we were originally considering that, we thought that, really this methodology is one that is used primarily to support an urban growth boundary expansion. And I personally wouldn't think that if a site is developed and occupied by a target industry user, and then, subsequently becomes vacant or unoccupied, that, at that point it's already inside of the UGB, it's been developed, it's been in use, and I wouldn't think that there would be special site protections on it at that point. But I'm open to Gordon correcting me or others disagreeing with my take on that.
This is Gordon. I agree with that.
Mhm. Okay, Nellie, you've been incredibly patient. Thanks for letting folks jump in front of you.
Oh, thank you, Lee. Nellie McAdams with Farmland First. I just had 2 comments. I wanted to express support for site protection, especially since it's just being used for target industries approach and not for the safe harbor. So, target industries is based on site specifications. And so cities should be required to preserve those for that industry that's been identified. I'd be resistant to a time limit on that, especially since there is a process for amendment already listed here. And I would wonder what would happen after that time limit is hit. Could it just go to any industry at all? Would there not be any planning around that? I think that could just lead to kind of wait and see approaches where large amounts of land would be requested for a white whale industry. If that didn't come around, then it could just be released for any kind of zoning. So that's my concern there. And then the second point that I'd wanted to make is related to what Gild said about demonstrating that the city is particularly well suited to that target industry. I wanted to sort of tie that back into my recommendation for including specific criteria for the land use regulations around target industries. So especially because more land is often allowed in under target industries than other approaches, I think that there should be some demonstration not only of goal 3, 4, and 5 weighing of factors, but also demonstration that this site is particularly well suited compared to other areas, not only in the state, but the region. And then that this city has the capacity to support this expansion. And I say that in part because cities outside of Metro, from my understanding, don't have to determine the capacity or how they would afford that expansion before passing the EOA and UGB expansion that happens afterwards. And so my concern is that cities outside of Metro would get to that stage, get the UGB expansion, and then be asked to determine whether they could actually do it and whether it was realistic. And I think that might be backwards. So my recommendation is that any land use regulations that permit target industries approach include those 3 items: the weighing of goal 3, 4, and 5, a demonstration that's well suited, and a demonstration of capacity to serve.
Sally, if I could follow up, what would that look like in your thinking of how a city could demonstrate capacity to serve a site before its inclusion in the UGB?
There, have been studies done. For example, a retired land use planner for North Plains did a study, magnitude of scale study that looked at transportation, water, wastewater, and I forget whether there was another utility that they looked at, but just at what the potential costs are, what the potential, if a new arterial needs to go in, what does that actually look like? So, this was a magnitude of scale study that, he did in, a couple months time. It wasn't an overwhelming amount of information, but it was at least sort of a ballpark for what the costs and process would be to serve this new land for the target industry.
All right, thanks, Nellie. Anthony?
Okay, two things. One, kind of more specific to the current conversation, and one just a kind of a question about language. So I'll go with the more narrow question first. Under 9, small a, big A, I'm wondering, I apologize, I should have caught this earlier, asked about it earlier. I'm wondering if there's a difference in big A, 9, small a, big A, between unanticipated employment uses and non-target industry use, or if those two phrases are really meaning to get at the same thing, or if maybe non-target industry use is even needed if the parameter is already constrained by unanticipated employment uses.
Yeah, good question. In my mind, they have an equivalent meaning and perhaps could just be pared down and remove the phrase non-target industry use. But we'll need to take a look at it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So now the broader question. I'm wondering to what extent either y'all or anyone has taken kind of a look at how these amended Goal 9 rules align to or align with the Goal 14 urbanization rules, and whether some of these suitability, site characteristics, and impact questions are also addressed through the Goal 14 process, and maybe are there may be some not duplicative, repeated work by doing the analysis in both places.
Yeah, thanks. That's a good thing to talk through. Oftentimes when the department receives an economic opportunities analysis that has used the target industries approach, it sometimes will include specific site characteristics that will end up pointing to a particular location for urban growth boundary expansion. And the Goal 14 analysis then relies on the included information in the EOA to make the case for specific parcels or sites. And so that's the connection that I see between these two pieces, because the target industry analysis is not going to be included within the Goal 14 analysis. But do you have concerns that it is duplicative?
No, I mean, I think that explanation helps me contextualize it a little bit more. If the work that would be being done um, through a targeted industries EOA is essentially preloading the work that would otherwise be done for Goal 14. That makes sense. But then I guess I would ask that we look at the parameters of what's actually required under Goal 14 to guide what's required under the EOA rather than something expanded or more broad.
Thank you. Um, we will make sure that we are taking a look at this, but in the meantime, if you have any concerns, would you send them our way? And then I should note that the rulemaking charge would prevent us from making any amendments to Division 24. I believe so. We really need to look at this from a Goal 9 and Division 9 perspective. So any suggestions that you have would need to be encased within this section of rule. Dave?
Thanks, Lee. Dave Honeycutt, Oregon Property Owners. Just want to share. It sounds like both yours and Gordon's desire, probably everyone's desire on this call for more frequent EOA updates. I think that's a great idea. But I also share and appreciate the concern of the cost and essentially the difficulty for a city to do that. I would ask that you understand that same problem is going to exist for a property owner of one of these sites who's looking at the need for an EOA update through a post-acknowledgement plan amendment because a targeted industry has either not cited or has cited and failed, at which point these rules would essentially limit the ability of the property owner to make any type of alternative use on that property and necessitate a post-acknowledgement plan amendment. it might be easier for all of us if instead of mandating under 9 little b and little c that the cities adopt regulations that limit incompatible uses, that you allow the cities to do so, but not mandate that they do so. That might make things easier and certainly provide more flexibility for local governments if a target industry either doesn't materialize or materializes and then fails.
Noted. Thank you, Dave. Well, I can't possibly believe that we have completely exhausted conversation on the site protections and designation in particular. But I think I might take advantage of this break just to talk about what our next steps are. So let me go ahead and do a new screen share. Let's see, can someone confirm for me that there's a slide on the screen that says draft rule discussion? Okay, thank you. I am just going to pass by this because I think that we've done a great job with that discussion. And again, you don't need to communicate all of your responses to that, during this meeting. Please do feel free to submit written comments to the department or give us a call to talk through things. We want to hear your thoughts about it. All right, so we're back in the slideshow, and this slide is titled Rulemaking Timeline. It's a visual aid showing the process of planning a rulemaking all the way through adoption of a new or amended rule by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. And we're sharing this just so that the committee has a sense of where we are in time currently with this effort. So a little history, we began this effort in 2023 by recommending to the commission that this rulemaking be on the department's policy agenda for the biennium. And then in March through July of this year, the Rulemaking Advisory Committee has met to provide technical advice, policy input, and today review the impact statements. Moving forward, in August and September of this year, DLCD will ask that the Department of Justice review the work of the department and this committee on the draft rule, and then we'll be publishing it for public comment and send out required public rulemaking notices so that the Land Conservation and Development Commission can be briefed on this rule in September during a public hearing where we encourage you to participate. And then following that hearing in September, the department is going to consider the public comment that we have received, as well as input from the commission, and finalize the rule. And it's possible that we will once again convene this rulemaking advisory committee in October to consider that public comment received as a part of that hearing, or any direction provided by the commission to make changes to what it is that we've proposed here. So with any luck, then the commission will hear and adopt our recommended amendments in December of this year. Are there any questions about our timeline moving forward? Okay. So this slide is titled Instruction and Next Steps for RAC members. We'll be sending out minutes from this meeting as well as any requested follow-up materials, including those racial equity and housing cost impact statements within the next week. Just to note that I'm going to be on vacation for a while here in mid-July, so please make sure that you're copying Casaria Taylor on any messages that you would like received more urgently related to this rulemaking. And then we'd like to invite your participation in the Land Conservation and Development Commission hearing scheduled for September 26th and 27th. And Gordon, did you have some guidance that you wanted to share with this invitation?
Yes, we like Lee said, we'd welcome your testimony to the commission First of all, based on the discussion today, we may be making some more hopefully minor tweaks to the rule. And we will, of course, send those out to you and, well before the commission meeting. And then we will, the commission will hold the hearing. It's going to be the first of the two rulemaking hearings. And we would welcome you to comment either in writing or in person or virtually in terms of testimony at the commission hearing. In fact, we strongly encourage you to do that, to give your points of view, especially, it doesn't pain me to say this, that especially if there are areas where you think there are concerns. We, of course, would love to hear from you if you agree with everything we've done, but even if you haven't, and especially if you haven't, we'd like you to share with the commission your concerns about any specifics on the language. The one thing we ask you not to do in your testimony, either in writing or orally before the commission, is you can tell them you are a member of the RAC, of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. We ask that you not assert that you're providing the perspective of the RAC. You're providing your perspective, not the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. You don't speak for the other members of the committee. You speak for yourself, but you speak for yourself as a member of the committee, and there's nothing wrong with telling them that. But other than that, we welcome and hope you will participate and comment on this when this goes to the Land Conservation and Development Commission in September. And as we said, the plan at this point, if the commission has significant issues or concerns that would require or make appropriate a follow-up rulemaking advisory committee meeting, most likely in October, we will, or perhaps early November, we will work to schedule that with you. The commission would then is scheduled to take this up a second and hopefully final time at its meeting in the first week of December.
Are there any questions about? Oh, thanks, Gordon. I was going to ask if there's any questions about the process for participation going forward. I would recommend, if you have not already signed up to receive GovDelivery updates on this rulemaking, that will be the best way that you can get an update about information for, signing up to provide testimony at the meeting, or deadlines for submitting written comments that will be included in the packet that goes to the commission. So I'll send out a link to sign up for that if you haven't already following this meeting. But yeah, we're looking forward to hearing from you in person, or the comments that you are communicating to our commission. All right. Well, I think that brings us to a close. So I just want to say thank you again very much for the time and effort that you have spent participating on this committee. I feel like working on this small section of Oregon administrative rules is a little bit tedious sometimes. And so I just want to thank you for your patience, and also occasional passion for making sure that we're getting it right, because it is really important. So appreciate your perspective, your knowledge, and your expertise. And that concludes us for quite a while, until October, if not forever. So thank you again.